Hi, good evening to everyone. Thank you for joining me again on this quick update about low vaccination outcomes in Papua New Guinea. I'd spoken about this about a year ago, and it was interesting for me to take a look at really, in terms of mortality, what were their outcomes. This is a country that was only 4.5% vaccinated at the time. So one would expect that they would have been decimated. Well, when it comes to science, I look at outcomes, not expectations. And if you're interested in that journey, please continue to stay with me. Now, if you want more information about different strategies, please remember, consider joining my course here looking at preparing for the next wave of COVID. Some people don't think that it's going to happen. On my point of view, I think that this is almost inevitable. And so we're looking at different strategies, including upper airway, over the counter stuff, prescription medication, dealing with as well some of the inconvenient things that are around. And as I said, that the particular thing that I'm talking about today, I can't say the name of it. We are currently in that kind of world where if you say the name of it, the video will certainly get suppressed. So just consider when I talk about it that it rhymes with a certain word called pectin. And you, for who are well aware as to what I'm talking about, will know what I mean. So, as I said before I start, remember if you're interested in this discounted course, please click on the link below and join us on this research journey. So, getting back to the point, when it comes to science, as I said, science looks at outcomes. And my rule early on in the pandemic was I looked at anything that could work. It didn't matter what it was, it didn't matter that I didn't think it. If somebody said this could work, I was going to look at it to try and understand the mechanism. Not necessarily just that something works, but what is the mechanism? Because if, for instance, something worked and someone was allergic to it and you only had one option, that person would have no options. That doesn't work. We need to understand the mechanism. You must always have a number of options that are available that could do the same thing or even work concurrently to make a difference. And that's therefore why when you're interested in understanding the mechanism about that pectin thing, you would need to take a look here. I can't say it again, so as you'd have to go to my Substack and you'd search through it, or take the course if you wanted to learn a bit more about it. The mechanism of action is the critical thing because it tells us what else would work. But why would I even think that something like this works? Because it makes no sense to the unobserved or the unprepared. And more importantly, why would it have been so important in this particular country, PNG? So here we have an interesting paper, and they were looking at managing a particular worm-based disease, and they were using three drugs, including albendazole, diethylcarbamazine, and this rhyming with pectin for lymphatic filariasis in Papua New Guinea. Now, what it is that's important to understand here is that this is a drug that is used very broadly in that system, in that country. They're well used to it, and therefore they are comfortable with the use of it. And that's important. They have bought into the fact that this is an important part of their lives. And what they were looking at in terms of the study was that they were looking at the effectiveness of it as well as side effects for the combinations. So they were using three drugs versus two drugs. And in that study, they were looking at about, I think, 2,000 people in different parts of the country. And it was part of a 5 country cohort looking at broad population usage. So that's one of the interesting things about rhymes with pectin is that it's known that it can be used at a very broad level with regards to countries. So it's relatively safe. And that's exactly what they were interested in. Now, I set that as the background to help you to understand why this became such an issue in Papua New Guinea. So I've pulled up here an article from 2021. And in this one, a hospital CEO was calling for a government directive to stop the use of this anti-worm drug for COVID-19 patients. They were very concerned at the time about misinformation. And you can see here that this is October 2021. And at that time, they highlighted that only 2% of the population had been vaccinated. And they were really concerned. I don't know if the writing is too small. Let me make it a little bit bigger here. But if you can read this here, what they were talking about is that it was going around in WhatsApp groups. And you can see here, this morning I woke up to, I don't know, 20 odd messages in one group about how this drug glorious it is. These are educated doctors, in some cases, who are still propagating this information. They were very concerned about it. They wanted to prohibit its use because, as far as they were concerned, this should not be used. All it was doing was fueling the problem because, as they said, the desperation in PNG, where only less than 2% of the population had their first dose, and misinformation is rife. So this is really what was driving that concern. And you have to remember at the time, they thought this was the only way out. And if you have something that distracts people from what is the best option, it is a serious issue. But what they should have asked is, why is it that this keeps on spreading? I guarantee you, if somebody started spreading a rumor now that you could use paracetamol to treat COVID, it wouldn't go very far, simply because it doesn't work. But when you see people actually doing something in multiple parts, a scientist would say, hold on, something doesn't make sense. I may not understand it, but I want to understand it. Those who are following an ideology would completely ignore it and say this is not possible. So let's get into the crunch of the matter, because you have to remember that by the time Omicron hit, there were only 4.5% vaccinated. They should have been decimated in the pandemic. A scientist has got to explain, how is it that a low-income country with limited health facilities and a very rural population with limited access to ICUs and so on, how would they fare in a disease that's spreading throughout the whole population at some point, even though if it wouldn't spread as quickly? Based on the scientific observations, one would expect that their population would have been very severely affected. Well, what were the outcomes? That's where it gets very interesting. Well, here are the outcomes. And this is taken from macro markets. You can see at the top here, Papua New Guinea death rate 1950 to 2024. And so it's looking through the general trajectory of that country. And it's comparing it to other countries as well. And you can see here, Papua New Guinea in the middle, close to Sri Lanka. These are the general annual mortality rates, 7.255 for Sri Lanka, slightly higher. And you can see all the countries around that are close with regards to that mortality rate. Here you have then 2012, and it was 8.205, and it was gradually falling all the way to 2018. What then happened when COVID-19 hit? Would it continue to rise? And if they had a problem, would they be absolutely decimated by it? So here's the first bit. In 2019 here, it was 7.408. It's still falling. And then in 2020, it's 7.364. This was the worst year for most countries. It's like it didn't pass through this country. How is that possible? What happened afterwards? Then we go on here in 2021, even lower, 7.321. 2022, 7.277. And you can see this gradual fall here, 7.234 in 2023. We don't know 2024 is 7.226. So this gradual fall follows the trajectory that they were having. It's almost as if COVID did not hit this country. It's absolutely remarkable. And even though they had some negative growths, there was no huge surge in deaths in this country. And so, as I said, from a scientific point of view, whatever your opinion, as long as if you're not following an ideology, you may say, well, there could be lots of other reasons for this, maybe. But it's absolutely fascinating that their outcomes were not according to expectations. Science should try and answer that. We saw the same question with regards to Africa. And people just say, well, younger population, whatever, it is just not relevant. Something happened in that country. It may not have necessarily been just about pectin, but from a scientific perspective, one would think you would want to know. So, as I said, in the end, science follows outcomes, not expectations. Anyone who tells you that's not possible is clearly not a scientist, because a scientist would say, I want to understand how it is possible. As usual, it brings questions about elephants in the room and whether or not this needed to be as broad a use as it was across the world. That's the reality, and probably the reason why this has not been properly investigated. It should have been one of the biggest scientific questions that everybody wanted to know. Instead, the world has remained silent and has ignored it, like many other pieces of science. But hopefully, time will tell that we will go back to the fundamentals of science, where politics and finance doesn't dictate everything that we do. Have a great evening.